For the record, Roald Dahl writes some of the best children's stories out there. He doesn't need to be censored. He's better than most of the other ones out there, so please, that just has to be stated. Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
A beloved children's author is getting censored. What is the
dun.
world coming to? We are talking about Roald Dahl, and the question, and actually, I'm putting the cart before the horse. Is he being censored? That sort of is the question here. So Roald Dahl, in case it's been a while or in case that doesn't sound familiar to you, the titles of some of his most famous books will be familiar to you, I dare say. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Matilda, James and the Giant Peach.
Fantastic Mr. Fox.
There you go. Fantastic Mr. Fox, which I think was brought again before audiences when the beloved, when Wes Anderson made it.
Oh, right. Yep.
So, yes. Now, also, if you've ever read any of these books, it's a good chance you've seen some of the movies, but if you've ever read the books, you'll know that they're a little bit different than your average children's book. They're kind of edgy. They're dangerous. Bad things happen to some of the characters. They do contain occasionally insulting language, but one of the striking features of Roald Dahl's work is that it doesn't talk down to children, and it doesn't give you a picture of a sanitized world.
Did you get Big Friendly Giant on your list?
Right. Yes.
BFG?
Yeah, the BFG.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
All right.
So it's not that these are, of course, exceptionally cruel or nihilistic or anything like that, but they don't give you the kind of sanitized vision of reality that a lot of children's books and children's entertainment, unfortunately, does. So I think they're actually, I'm a big Roald Dahl fan. I think they're actually quite refreshing. But that said, the publisher of Dahl's books is now changing some of the language. So I'll give you one specific example. Augustus Gluck from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is described simply as fat. That word fat has now been replaced with enormous. And I believe the Oompa Loompas are now called little people. So there are
instead of little men.
Yes, instead of little men. So some people, there's quite an outcry from some people saying, look, you're actually censoring these books. You're changing the words of the author. Roald Dahl is rolling in his grave right now. Others, no, this is an attempt to be more inclusive and to eliminate some offensive and cruel language from these books, which could be especially harmful, when it's being read to children.
Okay.
So there you go.
So let me pitch in why I think this is interesting. So there are some pretty exceptional changes, but it's interesting to me to watch. There's a progressive backlash to this too, in the sense that, I've even seen some people who write that are pretty far on the left side who would say, you know what, there's never going to be a sense in which it's appropriate to read Steinbeck's Of Mice and People. Like, it has to be of mice and men.
Yeah.
And so all of this, like, we're going to make it, I think in Fantastic Mr. Fox, instead of like one of the characters being attractive, she's smart or something like that. And they're like, what's like, are you saying, or no, she's kind. So they're like, are you saying attractive people can't be kind? But then the funnier thing is like, so it's gone through this like sensitivity screening, but does it really make a difference? So let me read you this. So you're talking about Augustus Gloop. So the 2001 edition reads this: a 9-year-old boy who was so enormously fat, he looked as though he had been blown up by a powerful pump. Okay, so they took the word fat out and left enormous. So the 2022 version says, a 9-year-old boy who was so enormous, he looked as though he had been blown up by a powerful pump. Great flabby folds of fat bulged out from every part of his body, and his face was like a monstrous ball of dough. That got changed down to great folds bulged out from every part of his body, and his face was like a ball of dough. I mean, so over to you, Cameron. Does removing the word fat there change anything in the description of what's actually happening with this character?
Well, no. I mean, obviously not. I mean, and it just, so it's superfluous on the one hand, and But on a more insidious note, I think there is it's important that people like, I mean, somebody of the caliber of a Salman Rushdie is coming
Mhm.
out and saying this is wrong. This clearly is censorship. Leave these great books as they were. And it's also worth pointing out as a side note that Roald Dahl is an interesting character. So as many writers
You could
are.
critique him for other things other than using the word fat.
Oh yes, I mean, if you read a biography of Roald Dahl, he was not not an especially nice person. Really brilliant, and really brilliant, but not very nice. In fact, one publisher, actually, very prominent publisher, and he'd made them a lot of money, dropped him because he was just so cruel with with their staff and their editors. And
Mhm.
basically, one guy finally stood up and said, "We're not going to take this abuse anymore, Mr. Dahl." So yeah, and he also wrote quite a bit for adults, by the way. I like a lot of Roald Dahl's grown-up stories as well. He wrote a lot of horror stories
Well,
and
there you go.
just an all-around interesting guy. And in fact, the one film I think that comes closest to Dahl's vision would be Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory with Gene Wilder. And I remember that was the first time I encountered Roald Dahl's work. And then not long after that, my mom read me some of these stories. But I would guess I'm not alone here. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is a pretty scary movie in some ways.
Well, I was gonna
It's
say, yeah.
eerie.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm not just talking about the bizarre LSD acid trip tunnel scene, which is inserted into the middle of a children's movie, but really at the heart of it is how unhinged Willy Wonka actually is. He really does come across as a kind of madman, and he's played brilliantly by Gene Wilder, but it's no surprise though because the screenwriter behind that was in fact Roald Dahl. And the whole thing is peppered with amazing references to the romantic poets and sort of obscure poems about fairies. So it's a very layered, rich experience, but it doesn't talk down to you. It's a film that represents the world as wild and weird,
But do you think
which
that
it
makes
is.
well, I was gonna say, does that make children's fiction more fun because it's more plausible if it's a little chaotic?
I think so, because I think the the really safe or sanitized visions of children's fiction that are, and again, the intentions are pure there. They're aimed at kind of, again, making sure that the child has a safe experience and enjoys. I mean, and I have two young children, so I get to see a lot of these sanitized visions in the form of television shows, and I just can't stand most of them. But occasionally, you get these wonderful exceptions like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, or to be honest with you, Mr. Rogers. If you actually watch
I was
Mr.
gonna
Rogers
ask you if
goes
there were some comparisons here with Mister Rogers because he hits pretty thick and deep stuff head on as well as a children's program.
he does. And but the other one of the striking things about Mr. Rogers, as I watch him now as an adult with my children, is that he understands, as so many adults don't for some reason, that children are very earnest. They're
Mhm.
real serious. He doesn't speak to them as though, in a silly voice and talk again, it's talking down. I think so many of us with the best of intentions, when we switch into children mode, this is a little bit less than a person. And so we're gonna be real silly and talk down to them rather than treating them as not exactly a total peer, but as a fellow human being. That's what he does so well. And yes, he doesn't shy away from difficult subjects. I mean, there are episodes on physical disabilities. There's one on divorce. So
Mhm.
that's and very, very different, by the way, I would say, from the show that has followed in his wake, Daniel Tiger. I'm not a fan at all
Uh-oh.
of
You
Daniel
stepped on your own
Tiger.
landmine right there. Someday we're gonna do
Yeah.
an entire show that's 30 minutes of Cameron listing all the things he doesn't like. It'll be great.
Here's what I
Part
don't
1.
like.
So
Yes.
Cameron, can I ask though, can I get a definition of censorship from you? Um, as you I mean, you're the literary mind between the two of us here. Um, so okay, so in James and the Giant Peach, the worm is no longer pink due to the new edits because pink, I don't know, is that like feminine or something? I don't. Anyway, I don't know why the colors of the worm is significant. In fact, most worms kind of are. So okay, in my mind, it's like okay, this is ridiculous, but is that Yeah, give me your definition of
Mhm.
censorship because there's changing something and then there's not allowing something to be published or talked about. What's the
Yeah,
continuum there, or how should we think about that?
yeah, and being put on the spot here, I don't really have a very good concise definition of censorship. So let me just think out loud for a second here. And I think
Womp,
as we
womp,
move
womp.
forward, they'll probably a better definition may emerge. But I mean, censorship involves obviously changing the intended meaning in some way, shape, or form in an effort usually I mean, so yeah, it involves a change to the actual meaning of what a particular author or person was trying to get across. Sometimes that change can be very drastic. It can be removing an entire section or just, you know, it could be you excise something, take it out entirely. Other times it's more subtle and insidious. You sort of rearrange and censorship is often politically driven or ideologically driven. And in this case, this is clearly politically driven and ideologically driven. So whole sections aren't being necessarily torn out of the book, but I would say this isn't I mean, this is just as bad, if not worse. This is they're just being subtly reworked and words are being changed in order to convey a different message. So if kind replaces attractive, that's actually changing the meaning.
Yeah. Well, is there a sense too in which we once you get off of the author's original word and word choices, and to be clear, like by the time a book goes to publication and somebody as well known as Roald Dahl, like each word is intentional. Like there aren't accidental words in books.
Oh, this
Um,
has been through multiple edits. Yeah, this has been
yeah.
carefully
Well, and
refined
so somebody
and
pointed
as
out
somebody as painstaking as fastidious. Yeah.
that there was a change made um in the 1970s version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory where Willy Wonka says that he got the Oompa Loompas from like deep dark Africa. And
Mhm.
so Roald Dahl made that change himself, saying, you know, that's
Yeah.
not appropriate connotation, and now they're like fantasy creatures, or I don't know what.
Mhm.
So so he himself made a change that he saw was not a, you know, not a good connotation there. Um, but once you get past the author making the change, you sort of open yourself up to this sense of like, well, what like, okay, so we're rewriting it in a way that in 10 years might be offensive to somebody else. So it almost seems like you get in this continuous loop of possibilities of conforming things to, okay, let's say that attractive to kind, and then kind, it's hard to think. Kind means something different. But I'm just saying, like, I is there a sense in
Yep.
which, and so I know like there's a slippery slope fallacy where you say, okay, once you make this
Sure.
change, all these other ones will follow. But this is one where I'm kind of like, yeah, but you're you're
Yep.
skiing at
But
this point.
no, you're not wrong though, but with when it comes to cultural standards are frequently a moving target and yeah, if you go down that road, you can keep making changes to bring something up to speed with current taste. But there are other reasons not to do that. So for instance, when you look at old films, particularly look at old cartoons, many of the so Warner Brothers and some of these other companies have chosen to put warnings, which I think are appropriate. If you watch something like, let's say, Betty Boop, you're going to see racist caricatures in these old cartoons, and they usually have a message just saying, you know, here's a warning, you're going to see some offensive material in here. We've not removed it because this is part of history, actually, and these were, while not defensible, these were products of their time, and we don't want to erase that. We've actually we have something to learn from that.
Oh, okay.
And
Hang on a second
yeah,
though, because this
yeah,
is where this gets real. Because Wendell Berry would make the same argument for Confederate statues.
yes, 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 he would. And there's a very, I think, legitimate argument to be made right there. Yes.
Yeah. So at what point do we edit from writing or from culture things of our past that we don't like, and what is the future educational value of them? And this would be Barry also, is does removing that thing actually change anything societally that actually
Yeah,
brings
and
real
there's not gonna
healing.
be a
So
one size fits all answer here, though. That's so the comparison that always gets made when you're talking about national monuments is to Nazi Germany. And they will say, well, of course, all of those relics of the Third Reich were removed. So why wouldn't we remove relics of the Confederacy, for instance? But is that exactly the same thing? Right? I mean, we're looking at specific cultures, we're looking at specific imagery and iconography and the role that they have played in a nation. So I'm bringing that up not because I have all the answers there. I'm bringing that up to say that this gets
I made that more
we're
complicated
gonna
in a
have to.
hurry. I appreciate that.
Well, it gets
So
complicated and it's case by case in some instances. But so, for instance, do we take now again to move back into the realm of pop culture? Let's take a movie like Disney's. I forget when it came out. I think it was maybe it the 1950s.
I
Peter
don't
Pan.
remember. I was
Yeah, so
negative
Peter
30.
Peter Pan contains some extremely offensive and derogatory depictions of Native Americans. I mean, and it just goes on and on at great length. So, do we would it be, is it the right thing to do to take that, censor it, change it so that we protect our children from that language, for instance, the savage language? I mean, one of the lines that just always just smacks me in the face every time I hear it, I never get used to it, is, "Remember, the Indian is not intelligent, but he's cunning." I'm just thinking, "Goodness gracious me."
Yeah.
But yeah. So, I mean, another example. I mean, and you could just keep rattling these off and off. I mean, another film that people just love, even though it's my goodness, this film is a whole lot more edgy than you realize until you rewatch it. But Breakfast at Tiffany's. I mean, there's some stuff in Breakfast at Tiffany's. My goodness. But one of them is Mickey Rooney playing this incredibly offensive caricature of a Chinese landlord in that. I mean, and that will also smack you upside the head when you watch that. Or the movie The Dam Busters, the original. I think that came out in the late 1940s or something like that. There's a black dog in in that movie, and its name is the N word. I mean, this stuff is just
So
we
okay,
don't you don't realize how much of it is stuck in our
s-
culture there. Yep.
so when you have a piece of art, and maybe we can broadly use the word art. We're talking about writing, we're talking about film, we're talking about statues. When you have a piece of art, I guess the question is it a fossil of our past or is it an influence of our future? And maybe therein lies the discernment category of how it is that you want to use this in your own
Mhm.
consumption or exposing your children to it. Um, does it does it work for pointing back to a time in which we had um, ignorant views of our own uh, prejudiced about some things, or do we say, "Hey, this is funny. Watch this. This should inform the way that you think about Native Americans." So I to me, there
Well, here
it's not
there's
immediately
that's a
clear.
really good way to Yeah, that's a really good way to ask the question, Nathan. But I think we're dealing with two very different mindsets here too, though. So if if you think that human nature essentially is what it is and it doesn't change, then you can look at those relics of the past, some of which are very offensive, as opportunities for growth, to learn, and also to instill the proper humility for us to recognize all of us to a certain degree are products of our own time and place, our environment, not totally explained by that, but we are. And we
Mhm.
have our own blind spots, just as our forebears did. And there are things that our grandchildren are going to be appalled at in our own lives and what we've done. Or that's one view. The other view would be no, human nature is constantly evolving and we're moving more and more toward a state of more and more pure enlightenment. If you think like that, then those relics of the past represent a serious threat. Because
Hmm.
we're supposed to outgrow those.
It's an
They're
embarrassment.
now they should be. Yeah, they're embarrassing. They should be obsolete. We don't think like that anymore. We don't talk like that anymore. We're inclusive now. We use inclusive language. We don't say fat. We certainly wouldn't say. I mean, that's
Wha
just incredibly
it
offensive.
it's just like, yeah, I okay, so I see that, However, all evidence is against that later view. I mean,
Absolutely. I
you
mean, I
just
don't.
have
So that's
Don
where
Lemon
I'm. Yeah.
getting criticized by CNN by saying that Nikki Haley is past her prime as a 51-year-old woman, and then everything
Mhm.
blowing up. I mean, like, if you want somebody
Yeah.
who's probably been through more sensitivity training, um, I would
Sensitivity
imagine
training. Yeah.
that I mean, so it's like we are
Protect
not
me
becoming
from.
angels. That's
Well, yeah.
essentially.
No. No, and also, yeah, we're not becoming angels. And despite the way, I mean, this is more of a side note. Despite the ways in which we fetishize youth here, we're not going to live forever. It doesn't matter how much surgery and how much time you spend in the gym. Eventually, your body does wear down, and you will die. That doesn't change. I mean, the limitations of. I think in some ways you see any kind of nod at human limitations is received as really offensive. If you
Yeah.
say, well, somebody's their age, they're older, they're past their prime, or they're overweight, or how dare you? Yeah, I mean, there are some elements where of our culture where we just seem to resist,
Well, so
the
yeah, so
reality of
but
human limits.
here's the danger that goes with this, and I've been thinking about this, reading several different things and thinking through some stuff, is that there's no such a thing as a Superman or a Superwoman. And many have pointed out, kind of since like Macbeth, you get this vision that when you cross the boundaries of humanity and try to transcend them, you don't get a superhuman. It becomes a monster. And so it's
Mhm,
not like you can become a superhuman. If you cross the boundaries of what it means to be humans, you end up with monsters. And I'm not talking like Frankenstein. I'm talking about people who do monstrous and atrocious things in the world
mhm,
who try to go past that. So having clarity on the limitations is not just um, it's a necessity for for your own personal sanity, but also for the safety of everyone else to have some. I guess I got us off track here on this, but bringing this back around then to how we, and this is a huge danger for the two of us. Like, let's say we do this for another 20 years. I guarantee that already we've said stuff that we'll look back on and be like, I wish I hadn't worded that way. Um, in
right.
fact, I know that's true because some of you write to us sometimes and say, think about that. I say, yeah. Um, so the question is, to what degree can we, from where we're at now, judge people in the past? That's a little bit of the challenge that's
Yeah.
also baked into some of this too.
One yes. So once again, if your viewpoint is, and you know, I've laid out two different views of human nature, and the way I've done so is a bit crude, and there's some over a generalization in there. So just hear me. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm just speaking quickly because this is a podcast. But
And you don't want to
again,
offend me. I get it. I appreciate that.
yes. But if you're of the viewpoint that human beings are getting better, the better angels of our nature are prevailing, so to speak, and we're becoming more enlightened. It's very difficult not to look back on the past with in a kind of sneering way and with a sense of superiority. But if you start reading history, I mean, any sensible and responsible historian is going to tell you how unbelievably rich of an imagination it takes to actually look back judiciously and try to step into the foreign mindset of somebody in a completely different place and time where the assumptions were not the same, where the world was not the same. Now, humanity is a universal category, so we can put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, so to speak. It's really remarkable that we can do that. It's almost magical, but we can. But the effort to do so will take real discipline and real training and humility, because the default is to basically look at the past through 21st century eyes at this point and just judge people who came before you by all the standards of your own age and culture. But that's an incredibly anachronistic way to look at history. And
Well, but so there's a value to it to the degree that you learn from it. So if you're doing that in a way to make yourself feel all high handed and moral and righteous, that's
Mhm.
laughable. However, if you're saying like, here's a well-intentioned person who is blind to certain things in their life, and you use that as a thing for self-reflection and for increasing your ability to care well and speak well of other people, then so we're not saying don't critically engage with it. We're yeah, I think I just want to make that distinction there that it can be profoundly helpful, but the reason that it's helpful is because the messed up parts of our past are still there for us to learn from. So, um
Mhm.
our messed up past should not make us feel better about ourselves. It should make us feel more careful about what we're up to. So it has to be there for our growth. It's not there, and it shouldn't be wiped away just for us to feel good about ourselves.
Yes, and I think let's turn real briefly here to the probably one of the central issues here for and I think many listeners are probably thinking, "Why haven't they gotten to free speech yet?" But free speech is a very precious thing. And so this is one of the reasons why I think the strong response to what's happening to Roald Dahl's books is warranted. It sets a bad precedent if you start taking these books, which are these ones are of course esteemed classics for a good reason. They're great stories. And frankly, it's worth just the inner critic in me just wants to point this out. Roald Dahl's books, his children's books are better than most of them out there. They are. They've stood the test of time because they're classics. They don't need to be changed and they don't need to be fixed in the first place.
You know what this did? This just massively jacked up the price of used Roald Dahl books. Everybody's going to
Oh,
want
yes, it did.
a pre 2022 copy of James and the Giant Peach. So go out
Absolutely
there
it
and
did.
invest now. No, sorry. I'm all right. Back to your serious point.
Right, but don't we don't want to but we don't want to change the works of authors and we don't want to monkey with with their with their wording because again part of an education, part of learning, part of going into the world of reading involves the danger of encountering other viewpoints, many of which are threatening, many of and some of which are dangerous. They are.
They use words like
But
fat
I
and
for
pink. Scary stuff.
fat and pink and then just to go a little further, I for one am grateful that we have available to us Marx's The Communist Manifesto, for instance. Now, do I think that that is a potentially dangerous book? Yes. Do I think it should go out of print and be removed everywhere? No. But do I think also, there's room for a more expansive discussion here. Should all children read just any book? Well, no, of course not. There is discernment that that comes in here. And I'm not saying, by the way, that if you've read Roald Dahl and you don't feel that he's appropriate for your children to read, that you're making a huge mistake. I don't. This depends entirely on your children and the way you've engaged with this book. I'm saying I'm glad books like that are out there, and I'm saying that when you become a reader and when you become a thinker, it's an invitation to look at the world through eyes not our own, to borrow phraseology from C.S. Lewis. And that is a dangerous endeavor. And so we do want to navigate with care, but changing the words and censoring the words and to suit the standards of a particular culture and age is a very bad step, I think.
Yeah, it makes me wonder. Like, is there a way that you could put Communist Manifesto through a sensitivity training exercise and edit it to be a more helpful? Like, so there are certain things that like changing a couple words isn't going to change the overall. And so I guess that's for me. Like, okay, make
Proletariat will be replaced by valued worker.
okay, you heard it first here, ladies and gentlemen. We'll get Chat GPT to help us with this new publication. But like some okay, there's changing adjectives, and then there are the constellation of those words in such a way that it crafts an overall narrative that's just beyond the um because you and I would both agree that Disney could produce a great children's film that has all appropriate words and a terrible message.
Yes,
So so part of it
they
is
have
like,
done
what's the
so.
level at which you want to would you say?
They've done so, in fact.
So all that to say is like the level I guess choosing our battles is part of this, but the level of engagement. And
Mhm.
I was looking this up the other day, and I don't know why. There was a point in time at which it would have been possible to have read every book printed in English, like early 1500s. You could have pulled it off in a lifetime.
You
Um,
you looked that up?
yeah, but so I mean, just think there was a point at which there might have been somebody who had read all of the books. But
Yeah,
just
that is
think
pretty
about that for a
remarkable.
minute as an
Mhm.
interesting thought. We're at least 500 years past that time. Um, and so everybody who's listening, and you and I included, have to think very strategically about what we want to dignify with our mental attention. And
I
that's
like that phrase.
a good project. Dignify with our mental attention. Yeah, kind of
Mhm.
rolled out on my tongue there. Um, yeah, I think that's the project for us all. To value the authors, even the ones that we disagree with, to be able to attempt to look and see arguments and ideas from a perspective that maybe isn't ours, or historically that we fundamentally disagree with, is part of the value of an education. It's part of maturing, to be able to clash your ideas with alternative ideas and then reason to why you want to be the way you are. Um, it's also a challenge to us, I think, not to read scripture with a censored viewpoint. Say, I'm going to skip over these verses because they irritate me and I don't think they're quite appropriate for my time. Um, Little challenge to myself there as Cameron was speaking on these things. So all in all, I think, in classic thinking out loud fashion, we don't give you, hey, here's what you should think about this. We're pointing to some things that we should be cautious about, things that we should celebrate, but ultimately it comes down to saying, let's use a phenomenal amount of discernment that we would grow spiritually and morally by interacting with some of these things, but never get into this false high horse, look down our nose, judgmental kind of thing to say, I thank you, God, I'm not like that man. Let's be those who beat our breast before the Lord and approach what he wants to teach us with humility. And then we can be serious about what we read. And sometimes we can just laugh at the attempts that other people have to tie themselves in knots to try to get out of things that maybe we see aren't really a big deal in this world in the long run. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.